Rafa said, I'm Dr. Sherry Hunt, Research Leader at the USDA-ARS Hydraulic Engineering Research Unit, and it's my pleasure to host the roundtable. And so if anyone in particular right off the bat has a question, I will toss y'all a softball pitch starting out. You know, I see students out in the audience, and I wish I could have done it something different back in college, courses that would have gotten you a better handle on what you're doing today, that you could have gone back and rethought things. Go ahead, Kyle. Oh. Yep.
By a show of hands, how many people out in the audience consider themselves ecohydrological researchers? This is our problem. You guys don't fess up. I think that it's broader than what, I think we have a little bit of a self-conscious issue here somehow, Mary Lee. How are we gonna boost our membership to gain more confidence in what we provide to the ecohydrological field? Sometimes it's a little intimidating, especially getting starting out, seeing, today, the great research presented by this panel, but there's all different scales and complexities and scopes of ecohydrological research, and it's all needed. And I think, starting with the people in this audience and the people here at this conference today, we need to really keep pushing and keep building that literature base in ASABE to help steer the future. That's my question to you. Now you get questions.
I'm not necessarily going to comment on that, but I do want to share with you that we had an ecosystem services project in Florida where engineers and biologists, ecologists working together. And one of the challenges, at least for me as an engineer, we came across in some of our undergraduates who were graduate students at that time, that especially some of our undergraduates are not so well trained, or at least they don't have a background in ecology, or at least in that our biology in general, or biodiversity. So do you have any comment on that? And then I'll have a following up question. What can be done to encourage that?
I agree with you. One of the important things, even learning the jargon, if you go to ecology meetings, it's complicated to think with, in fact, same concepts in different contexts can have different names. What you call the extinction depth in ecology is called reactivity in system dynamics, etc. But if I were to give advice to graduate students, which I keep doing it's just to read broadly and get classes in ecology, get classes in hard methodological engineering classes, and perhaps takes a few to just even without as a general idea. That's what I keep telling my students. Don't limit your classwork in grad school to the field you're working on, because you have to adapt like an ecosystem, right? Looking ahead, things change, fields change. Scientific interest of a scientific societies like ASABE need to adapt in time because the priority changes, etc. So that's the best advice. But I agree with you. There's an initial complicated thing, even understanding what the language, how the language works, the jargon, the tics of the different societies. And well, like you see, Chut is without a tie. Is well known. When I go to science meetings, I never put a tie. I just dress like him. If I go to an engineering meeting, I put a tie and a jacket. That's a tradition. You have to adapt.
Sorry about that.
So my uncle was a high school biology teacher, and I was always impressed with him because he didn't always know the answers, but he could always ask an intelligent question. And I think that sometimes we're limited because we feel like we need to be experts in ecology as engineers, and I don't think that's true. I think we need to be able to work within interdisciplinary teams, which means we need to understand the language, understand the jargon, and be able to understand it well enough that we can ask good questions and be able to push the ecology in the direction of the systems approach that we espouse as engineers. Bring your own expertise to the table and try to learn enough about the other parts of the system to be able to ask good questions.
And along the same lines, and our experience has been that the emphasis, the quantification aspect of the problem, I think is a critical issue that we as engineers can address. And soon, for better or worse, I think ecological, biological fields, and not always the case, of course, there are wonderful biomathematicians out there, but by and large, the field lacks a little bit of quantification skills in general. So as engineers, if we're able to talk to these other groups, we can soon establish ourselves as the analyst of the system, the modelers, the system analyst, and I think once the word is out, you really get a lot of interest from other communities and that they come directly to you for this kind of analysis. I think that is a great niche for ASABE engineers in our field.
And again, this is from experience working with ecologists and their different world almost, in the sense of like, typical engineering model application, you have Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency and whatnot. And you have a higher expectation because predictability of physical systems, of course, is much better in a way. When you compare, for example, we were trying to look into fish, frog, and invertebrate, predicting that as a function of changing water in the landscape as part of ecosystem services. It was really amazing to see that we almost come from different directions. For example, a very simple example will be R square of, let's say, 0.7, 0.8. You get engineers excited. And that is almost non-existent in ecology. You get 0.1, 0.2, and that's just, that's how much you get. And a lot of times there was this almost, and this is when you're sitting around the table and recommending it to policymakers as to what changes can be made at the landscape, large, I'm talking about, millions of acres. A lot of times the lessons learned from the field are that the more complex the model, more and more of those models are failing to convince the policymaker because of, I would say, difficulty in understanding and making changes. If you look into Latin America ecosystem services, so I would like to see if, I'd like to have you comment on what's your take on the complexity and desirability of between ecologists and engineers as to what level of prediction is good enough for policy making. Thank you. Sorry for a long question.
It's quite, you're an interesting character. About convincing policymakers, first you have to figure out that I am Italian, so chances are zero to convince a policymaker in Italy with good science. Good science never becomes good policy, but you hammer it and soon enough you get into a certain point in which this happens. But there are several edges. I was taking notes actually. I thought I was off the hook. I'm not. One example, for instance, if you start, for instance, many ecologists are outstanding mathematicians. Okay, so you look at those papers and you're really impressed with the way they manage their systems, etc. Especially noisy systems. So early on in the game, they realized, and it was mentioned today in quite a few talks, that stochasticity is an effect, that your system are frustrated, are shaken by natural fluctuation of the system. And all of a sudden we started digging in the system, and we were looking like models of, for instance, of vegetation, of biomass persistence and the likes. And we see this noise term, multiplicative, additive, Fokker-Planck, blah, 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 things. And all of a sudden you start asking, and ecology is treated like, say, Gaussian white noise. It's rainfall. Daily rainfall is not a Gaussian process. It's something we know. We've been knowing for like 100 years how these deals with. So there's a lot of still coming from the agricultural community, coming from the hydrological community, or the engineering or geosciences side that we can teach them actually. And that's one of the things. So never be shy. I mean, try to learn their languages, because there's a lot that you know from your upbringing that can be useful to them. But the second thing is that I would quote famous physicists who said, models are fun and sometimes even instructive. In fact, yes, you can actually, you have to know your problem well. We are rooted not in the technical details, we are rooted in the knowledge of a problem, which you have to have digested really well. Talking to a graduate student, to a young scholar. Then gain skills to transform into that problem. Gaining skills is quite an interesting process nowadays. The university is changing. We're going to have Google degrees probably soon enough. I'm taking a MOOC right now, a massive online open course, because when I had your age, I was the best coder that was around. And now, because then becoming a professor, you lose it because you don't have time. I'm behind with that. I'm catching up with programming languages. MOOCs are fantastic, are free, are open, are everywhere. Skills can be gained, but your root is in the problem. And never betray your field of origin, but be contaminated with skills that come up from around. I don't know if I answered your question, but I can chat forever.
Okay, got the mic. Okay, this is a very different topic. One of the things that's on my mind right now is the International Drainage Symposium, which the NRES 23 drainage group here is actively planning. And one of you mentioned, you said all fields have a history. I think it was Indrajeet. And there's a illustrious history there, starting with the first International Drainage Symposium in 1966, when the focus was obviously how to get the crops drained and the effect on drainage. For at least 20 years since I've been in the field, certainly we look at drainage and water quality kinds of issues. But what I've been thinking about this morning is how to integrate ecological aspects of drainage. And so I just thought I'd throw out the question of, do any of you have thoughts how to have an ecohydrology kind of drainage scale? And especially Kyle's presentation really got me thinking. There's so many things to think about there, but of the extent of the time scale and spatial scale that it might be appropriate to throw out in the field of drainage.
I think, Jen, there are lots of opportunities, in my opinion, to take ecological perspective into drainage work and drainage research. And going back to the hypothesis that we talked about, how biota can be manipulated to affect hydrology. And drainage alters hydrology in a very, very different way compared to the natural runoff generation processes, whether it's saturation excess or infiltration excess that we know about. So there is one, I'll give you one example to illustrate my point. And an example is role of buffer strips or filter strips in controlling the amount of nutrients that get into the stream. And when you've got the buffer strips, we know that they are very effective if designed well to take out significant proportion of sediment and nutrients from the runoff before it gets into the stream. But the moment tile drainage is present, it becomes hugely ineffective because very little surface runoff is present. And runoff is not going to go through the filter strip anymore. So what is the purpose and how that can be reconfigured in a way that we are still able to take out the nutrients from now subsurface runoff that's getting into the stream, and not over account for role of buffer strips that may be present in the landscape. You still see that. I still see some credit being given to that when we know as an engineer for fact that the stream runoff is not going through the system. So what can be done? I think there are lots of opportunities.
I think, in particular, the field of drainage, where the topology of the network is very well known. I mean, a lot of these techniques, ecohydrological network-based techniques are just, ready for use. You can predict a lot of the behavior at the larger scales based on that topology, changes in topology, effects on water quality, species, and so on. So I think for what we heard from Dr. Rinaldo this morning, that would be like a direct application there.
Jane, I kind of agree with you. You talked about the fascination of different scales. And I think even for fields with a long history like drainage, taking a step back and looking at things from a different scale, maybe a smaller scale, maybe a finer scale, maybe something not just at the drainage spacing, but something much finer, and look at the impacts of drainage at that small scale. Or conversely, over the multi-decadal, historical scale. Changing the scale really changes your perspective, changes the type of data that you need, the type of analyses you need, and really will move us in a direction of more robust understanding of that system. So I think in any field, drainage being an example we're talking about here, but apply it to whatever you're working on, take a step back and change the scale of your thinking, and it'll have profound influences on how you approach the study and the results that you'll get.
Margaret had a question.
This question is for Indrajeet as well. You talked about the need for more experimental. Talked about the need for more experimental data. I wonder if a lot of that, data are not already in existence, that maybe are in different hands. So what's your view on data sharing and maybe approaches in which, through which this data can be collected somewhere together, in which it can be used in a more meaningful way?
Margaret, if I understand your question correctly, what you're asking is how we can share the data and how we can assimilate the data from different areas to be able to work together. I think that's really a great point. And data sharing, I think, has not been as much as it should be in the scientific area. And one of the only recently, very recently, funding agencies have started to put a requirement that you must make your data available, and still I don't think that it becomes fully available. There are many examples of that kind. So I think its burden is back on us scientists, not be a hoarder of the data and think that someday I will be able to analyze the data and publish yet another manuscript out of that, when in reality it really does not happen. One of the developers of the SWOT model, Jeff Arnold, once said in his presentation, it's amazing how much can be accomplished if you stop worrying about who gets the credit. And I think we need to keep that in mind with the data sets also. If the data sets that we have got, if we take a decision to make it publicly available so that everyone can see that and download it, and there is certain QA/QC and metadata information behind it, it's really amazing. Because ecohydrology and many other things, not just the ecohydrology, the problems have become so complex that it really takes an interdisciplinary team to be able to make a significant advancement. And knowing what data exists from other fields is very, very important, and only way that can be done is to share the data in a public platform. Excellent point you have raised.
I'm not really sure how to put this into question form, but I'm following up on Jane's question about tile drainage, because it just triggered this reality that we're dealing with in Iowa. I don't know if any of you are aware of the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit that they're bringing against 3 Iowa counties about nitrate moving in tile drains. And I don't know where this is all going to go. It's scheduled for a federal court in 2016. And if you know anything about the Des Moines Water Works, they have the largest nitrate removal system in the world. They take the water from the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River, you know, and they're constantly dealing with high nitrate levels. And there was a big spike, I think in the fall of I'm not sure if it's 2013 or 2014. I kind of forget right now. And this sort of drove them over the edge. And, you know, they're faced with probably having to ramp up, you know, with a larger system, more costs, with taking nitrate out of the water to make sure the concentrations stay below, you know, the 10 milligram per liter standard. And I'm just throwing this out because this could become something that begins to throw people like ag engineers into a realm that we probably don't want to be in, but, you know, could become frontline people with dealing with some pretty nasty confrontations on a societal level. And I don't really have a question. I'm just throwing it out for thinking about it because, you know, we're talking about scales and all this kind of stuff and talking to policymakers, and we may be talking to policymakers in a big way in the not too distant future on this kind of stuff. So
I have a question for you then. I guess that, and at least another question, perhaps as a statement, my guess is that in 10 years from now, you have to throw away whatever code you have for calculating catchment scale transport processes. No more than 10 years. Things are changing radically these very days. And this is an interesting point because it's okay, you're talking about a catchment subject to certain agricultural use, and you get tiled, non-tiled, or whatever, and you want to evaluate what's the nitrate transport through it, including possibly in-stream processes in there. Again, my guess is that in 10 years, whatever code you have is going to be thrown away and done again. So the answer is side by science. That's what ASBE should be doing. You have to side by the science that continuously updates its knowledge, and it's checked by peers, and in the end, problems like the Des Moines River you were mentioning, which is a very interesting one from several viewpoints, will be tackled. So I think it's a statement based on what you say.
I think one other thing that we should be thinking about is that water quantity and quality, which have been our focus for many years, is probably not the end all in all, but rather how that particular water quality and quantity is affecting whatever function you are looking after, which of course goes through the ecology of the system in whichever aspect you're looking at. So broadening the question beyond just the indicators of water quality and quantity into the ecological function or the service of the system really is a major jump, a mind jump that is going to allow us to really understand, move into this specialty closer. So I think we've done this with the group, and you know, we question continuously, well, it's not about the nitrogen or the phosphorus anymore, but how those two particular components with sediment and others might be affecting the function of the system. And at times you get very contradictory results. Okay? Things that you would suppose to be problems might or might not be a problem when you couple it with the ecological response.
Phil, in my opinion, you know, this whole tile drain and nitrate and now even phosphorus transport issues and that coming at the forefront of some of the complex problems we are facing is very analogous to what we had seen in 30s and 40s with the straightening of the rivers, where the objective was to get the water moving as fast as it could and enable the navigation in those rivers without paying any regard to either natural functioning of the river or impacts on the ecosystems. And now, you know, several decades later, we realized that was the criteria perhaps was very narrow-sighted and should have been broader in terms of managing the river networks. Same way, having tile drains has enabled us to be such a successful egg crop producer in the world among the leaders. So there is no doubt about that. But we must consider other related processes and how that gets affected, and how do we bring that into account when we propose solutions to the problems. So one project that I know Jane is getting started with about reusing the water and not letting it go into the drainage ditches and just run off with water that is so rich in nutrients, how we can recycle some of that. And looking into ecological response, we have to consider that in order to have a sustainable solution. And that's where some of the combination of ecology and hydrology becomes even more important.
We're going to have one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rafa for closing remarks.
Hi, I have kind of a broad question about thresholds. And so in my experience with the literature in ecohydrology, I've noticed that there's often many calls for identifying thresholds in ecosystems and how they relate to water quality, and also just the hydrologic regime of different systems, and these are often used for water management targets. And in the presentations today, we saw how stochasticity can really affect the ways in which we see responses from these systems. So I was curious if you all had opinions on whether we should defend the use of thresholds, or if there might be alternatives to thresholds that could be pursued in research. I'm not sure if that quite makes sense. So if there are alternatives to using thresholds for different policies, or what you view as maybe ways to take into account more stochasticity in the way
can you specify what kind of thresholds are you talking about?
Well, so I guess I was thinking of, for example, with total maximum daily loads, there are often these fairly specific thresholds that are implemented for certain water quality targets. At least in Florida, which is where I'm at, we've seen issues with meeting these total maximum daily loads, and I wonder if there might be opportunities in research to sort of move beyond this mentality of using very specific thresholds for some of our water quality targets, or targets in other systems.
I think it's awesome that Natalie's thinking ahead of 5 of the leaders in ecohydrology, and really you're making an amazing point, because we have in this country so often focused on one parameter or one threshold, but it's really the population, isn't it, of all these parameters, ecosystem services that's defined. So does that give you a minute to think of an answer?
So I think you said there's an alternative to thresholds. That's what you said, right? Potential I think it depends. I think thresholds is, I think as you understand more and more about the nonlinear dynamics of the system, you get a better idea of what kind of criteria you should use. I think thresholds are good for some purposes, but not always. Maybe it's just a substitute of something more complicated, but then you understand it so much. I think that goes back to the other person's, the previous question about how to convince policymakers. Sometimes maybe from the fundamental understanding point of view, threshold might not be the best thing, but then maybe it's a good approximation, and it's easy to communicate to policymakers. So I think that there's a use for that. But then when you want to do the research for fundamental understanding, sometimes maybe thresholds are not necessarily the best all the time. And then if you know more, maybe just, and I think we at least thresholds have been used. Maybe could be said to be used loosely. I mean, there are a lot of threshold, and it means slightly different things for different people. I don't know if you know about the literature of a regime shift. So there could be a threshold that you would shift from one stable equilibrium condition to another, but then there's also some kind of sharp change in relationship between two things, and people call that thresholds as well. And so that's what I mean. If you wanna go for more fundamental understanding, you don't have to tie yourself to thresholds, but I think it's good approximation sometimes. I hope I partly answer your questions. I think useful. And sometimes I can be a bit technical. In the simple model that I show, by using the simple linear, piecewise linear function and define certain threshold, it make my calculation easier. At least for that purpose, it's useful for that as well. Yep.
I kind of heard two different questions there, one related to thresholds and the other one related to TMDLs or targets, I might call them, or limits. I'm a big proponent in our research to really maintain the full complexity and try to understand the system and all the important facets, thresholds, and but in my work in the Everglades, I've come to realize that policymakers don't really value that level of complexity and understanding. Policymakers want a target, a single target, a very simple target, so that they have something to focus their attention on. We have one target that has one variable, so that as water depth changes, the target of phosphorus level changes. That level of complexity overwhelms policymakers, that simple level of complexity. And so targets are let's say, without the target, we have a target, there was a lawsuit, federal state lawsuit, and out of that lawsuit came a target for phosphorus in the Everglades. Without that target, there would not be the level of effort to improve the Everglades ecosystem that has happened in the 10 to 20 years since then, to the tune of billions of dollars of investment, both state and federal, that would not have happened without a target. And so I sometimes grumble about the simplicity of the target, and it's like, well, I don't know that I can entirely support that target. However, without that target, progress from a policy perspective is almost intractable. And so I believe there's a role for those simple targets to help mobilize effort. I believe it should be undertaken adaptively and revisited over time as we gain more information and we get feedback about how the system's responding to our changes. But changes won't happen without simple targets.
All right, I want to thank our panelists for their presentations today and the roundtable discussion, and thank our audience for some awesome questions. I'm going to turn it over to Rafa now for closing remarks.
Thank you once again to the panelists. You can, if you want, resume your seats. And as a closing event, I'm going to invite the president of ASABE and executive director, Darren. And the last thing that we would like to do is we were hoping that we were going to do this during the awards luncheon, but unfortunately, Dr. Rinaldo, don't go away, Andrea. You have to stay over. And because he has to go to another meeting at the end of the week, he's not going to be able to stay on Wednesday. But with that, I'm going to turn it to Terry, our president, to take over.
Okay, Andrea. I'll just give a few brief remarks as we present this award. As many of you know, my field of agricultural and biological engineering is food processing, and so I will be the first to admit I know nothing about ecohydrology. And so just to sit in here for just a few minutes and just hear the discussion makes me just again appreciate the breadth of our profession and the work you're doing. And so many of you have been friends of mine for different years and for many years for different reasons and committees I've served on. But to see you in your element talking about your work is inspiring to me, and I appreciate what you do to benefit society. And so you have a very special program going on today, the Ecohydrology program, and I realize there's another session that starts at 2:30 and then a poster session that has over 100 posters in it later on. But we thought this would be a great time, to have as big a group as possible just to recognize Dr. Rinaldo for his presentation today. And he's being awarded a Distinguished Scholar of the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers. And so we have a medal to present to you. Look at this. It's very beautiful. And I've never put one of these on before, so you can wear that with pride today. And it's inscribed on the back. It says, for exemplary contributions leading to the advancement of agricultural and biological engineering, Andrea Rinaldo, 2015 Annual International Meeting, New Orleans, Louisiana. And again, it's a Distinguished Scholar Medal from the American Society of Ag and Biological Engineers. So congratulations, and thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, it is. So.